welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this final event of Arctic Climate Week here at Harvard Kennedy School. We're delighted to have so many of you with us in person, and we're also really thrilled to have a great turnout on Zoom. So thank you very much for joining us on Zoom. Tonight, we're going to be hearing from Causey and from Nadia Filimonova as they discuss tonight's topic of Arctic environmental security. And this, as I say, this is the last of a series of events that we've been running for Arctic Climate Week. If you've missed any of them, then we're hoping that we will have all of the talks available to put online within the next few weeks. So hopefully you won't miss out too much. And if you have come along tonight and suddenly you're really enthused and excited about everything that we've been doing, you will be able to go back and review that. So tonight, introducing our speakers, we have Vic Hogg. Vic is a first-year Masters in Public Policy student here at Harvard Kennedy School and is a research assistant with the Arctic Initiative, where they're researching COVID-19 in an Arctic context. Vic is also refounding the Native and Indigenous Caucus at the Kennedy School and is passionate about uplifting Indigenous issues here on campus. Vic.
Thank you so much. My name is Vic, and I have the pleasure of introducing our two speakers tonight. And apologize that it won't be that beautiful of an experience because my voice is kind of messed up from the game this weekend. So first, starting with Professor Doug Causey. Professor Causey is a professor of biological sciences at the University of Alaska Anchorage and a principal investigator of the Department of Homeland Security Arctic Domain Awareness Center of Excellence. An ecologist and evolutionary biologist by training, he has authored over 200 publications on the environmental correlates of Arctic climate change. He and his students are actively conducting research on the Aleutian Islands, northern Bering Sea, and northwestern Greenland. His Greenlandic research efforts are funded by the National Science Foundation and are components of the, I'm gonna butcher these names. Can you tell us?
Try it.
The Penieric and the Picolisoric initiatives?
More or less.
Told you it wouldn't be beautiful. He has published extensively on policy issues related to the Arctic environment, Arctic environmental security, and bioterrorism and public health. And our next speaker is Nadia Filimonova. Nadia is a fellow at the Arctic Initiative and an affiliate fellow at the Institute of Advanced Sustainability Studies at Potsdam. She also is a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. In the past, she has worked in Russian and Swedish research and education institutions. Nadia has been the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards and an author of several peer-reviewed publications. Her current research focuses on urban climate change governance in the Arctic. And I'll just throw in a personal note. In my work as an RA with the Arctic Initiative, basically everyone I've talked to has told me I should talk to Nadia because she knows so much. So I'm very happy to have the chance to hear you speak, and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad you're here. So what we'll do is I'm going to give a very brief presentation on what is Arctic environmental security as a means of setting the stage. And then Nadia will talk about what the current situation is in Russia as relate to what I'm talking about. And then we will open it up for questions. And I'm sure and I hope that we have a lot. So what is Arctic environmental security? And next slide. This is what I am not going to talk about, okay? These are the key topics which comprise, as you'll see in a minute, the major components of environmental security. And we're talking about this in the context of climate change. So ecological response, human resilience, and defense and sovereignty. Next slide. Forgive me, I'm going to show you Venn diagrams. You can't give a lecture without Venn diagrams, but it'll make sense to you. This area here, this green circle here, is the whole area of ecological research. And this is where you're looking at the environmental status and integrity of ecological process and services. Take a class in ecology and you'll find more about it. Next slide. Social study, in this case, human resilience, is the status of the human community that depends on the environment. And this is another whole area of research done by sociologists and human ecologists. We're not going to talk about that either. Next slide. Defense security, the role of the nation-state assessment of threat and consequence. Well, you're in the right building to be studying that, okay? Is that an enormous topic? We're not going to talk about that either. Instead, what we're going to talk about are the intersection areas. Next slide. I'll get to those in a minute. So, without fussing about these general topic areas, think about the intersection, and I will talk more about it, as it's affected by climate change. Next slide. Political realities. Next slide. Land tenure and indigenous rights. And for those of you who are not sure what that term means, land tenure essentially is who owns the land. And that can be legalistic, or it can be what has always happened. This is an extremely important area that is changing. Next slide. International policy is affecting this. Next slide. And regime change, how things are changing. Now, this diagram here, what I want you to appreciate is three very large areas of study. We're interested at the interactions. And that part that's in the middle with the question mark, that is environmental security. Understanding all the dynamics of these areas here as they relate to the intersection area. Next slide. You have probably seen one version or another of these kind of slides in the previous talks, okay? And by now, students, you should be used to looking at a polar projection, which is kind of a weird way of looking at the world. The North Pole is at the center of the diagram there on the upper left. Greenland is about 7 p.m. Alaska, where I'm from, is about 12 p.m. And then the whole right side of that is Russia. Nadia is going to talk about the entire country of Russia in her 10 minutes. That was sarcasm. Okay. All right. So the picture you see on the left, that's what the extent of ice was in the Arctic Ocean in 1985. And the colors, this is really important. The red color there is showing you the extent of multi-year ice. This is ice that's 4 to 5 years old. Why that's important is, first, it's thick, it's durable, and it doesn't move very much. The younger the ice is, the more flexible it is. And you'll see in the right-hand side at the top, that's for 2019. And you can see the extent has changed as well as the extent of old ice. And the bottom graph there, again, this is a pretty common diagram. The years are on the horizontal axis, and that the vertical axis is the extent in millions of hectares. And what you see is not only is the amount of ice decreasing, but the amount of old ice is also decreasing. Next slide. Okay, so all of these issues, I'm only going to show you one picture of climate change. This is just an example of it. These all are going to, as you'll see in a minute, impact the ecology, the human resilience, and defense as well. Next slide. This is a video that my students took a couple of years ago in the town of Qaanaaq, Greenland, which is the furthest north continually occupied indigenous village in the world. It's, if you can visualize this, where Greenland and Canada come together, that's essentially where Qaanaaq is. And so what you're going to see is a recording of people talking about how climate change has affected them. And I want you to pay attention to like the last 10 seconds of what you hear. Okay.
About 2 meters thick. Right now it's 45 centimeters thin. So climate changing is going fast.
The amount of ice is decreasing a lot. Since the 1990s, there has been less. There are less areas where we can travel on the ice, and we cannot travel as far as before. 60 or 70% of the ice is now melting. It used to be as thick as 2 meters, but for about 5 years now, it is only 1 meter thick. To be only a hunter is now becoming limited. Since the ice is disappearing, I think our way of living now is moving to be more of a fisherman. The seal is so important to the community up here, also including my family. The skin is used for rope and for gloves and other traditional clothing. The meat of the seal is also important for the dogs and for the people up here, including my family. Economically, the seal skins also support us financially. We eat it and sell the skin for money.
I never thought I would be a hunter. I wasn't raised that way, and now I am a hunter. My wife, she's a worker, and the way we pay the bills for electricity, for the oil, for the heat for our house, I try to be supportive to the family as much as possible, to try to survive up here, economically balancing with my wife through the hunting and fishing. Mostly I rely on hunting as opposed to fishing, but after I heard about all the jellyfish being sold last winter, I thought maybe I would do more fishing. I thought maybe in the next year I would balance it by hunting and fishing at the same time. Now I am constantly eating from the animals I've caught from nature. That's how I survive, and that's how I want to stay in the future.
To be a hunter up here is getting hard. Pressure from the outside world is having an effect on the government. They are making more rules on hunting, so it makes it more difficult to be a hunter.
Okay, next slide.
Sea ice is
There we go. Just quickly, this is a diagram from the Arctic Council's Circumpolar Arctic Flora and Fauna Group. And this is showing you as of 2010, what the zones of marine activity were viewed to be. And again, this is looking at what the ice used to be. The one I want you to look at is the yellow major fisheries. Now, you heard last week about the Central Arctic Fisheries Agreement. If all they were interested in was the Bering Sea at the top and then this part just north of Scandinavia, there wouldn't need to be an agreement. But things have changed so much that the areas that you see in purple, which before was the province only of research, is what we're talking about in the next coming years about where fisheries will take place. Next slide. All right, 2 more slides. This is a diagram of where the projected shipping routes are intended to be. And you'll see that on the left-hand side is blue, that's called the Northwest Passage, and that is along the Alaska coast, the Canadian coast, and then down through Baffin Bay. The red is the Northeast Passage, and this is along the entire coastline of Russia. The green is what would happen when the Arctic Ocean opens. Those look like long distances, but those still are about only half the distance to transport goods from Asia to Europe. And so, next slide. Next slide, I'm going to skip that. This is a diagram done by the Guggenheim Fellowship looking at the relative projected economic development. On the rows are different aspects of economic development. The columns are different countries. What I want you to see is that the economists have projected that it's transportation where the economic development will take place. The other rows there, in some cases, depending on the country, is not very important. This is 5 years old, and as I was talking earlier to one of the students here, Now that there is understanding that rare earths are more easily available in Greenland and the west coast of Alaska, suddenly this diagram is outdated. Next slide. This is just quickly, this is a advertisement for the research we do on birds and the pathogens that they carry. And all I wanted you to see is that birds don't know anything about national boundaries. They fly wherever they want. The point is that, for example, up there in Alaska, birds that breed in Alaska come from many other parts of the world, including terns, for example, as you see in the yellow there, that are coming from Australia and Asia. They're transporting whatever it is they have in them to the Arctic. Next slide. Okay, this is the last slide I wanted to show you. We're back to that Venn diagram again. This is my pitch to you. I'm showing you here the research areas that are in desperate need of somebody to work in. So the red dots that are fully inside of that circle, for example, the top one, the red circle that's in the defense there, it says defense policy and multi-state treaties. That falls under the heading of security studies. All right, that's not environmental security. Understanding that is really important. But the dynamics between the ecology and defense gets us into something called resource wars, which is countries and our nation states looking at resources that may lie in the area of another country. This is an extremely important cause of not only international conflict, but civil war. Biodiversity, biodynamics, that's what an ecologist does. But again, if you look at the intersection area there between human and ecology at the bottom there, socio-ecological dynamics is one of the key aspects affecting the Arctic, and so on. So that's all I wanted to talk about. I wanted to give you a brief overview of the major components of what structures environmental security and in the context of the Arctic. Now I'm going to leave it to Nadia to explain all of this as it relates to Russia.
Thank you, Doug, for outlining the complexity when we talk about environmental security in the Arctic. And I would just like to briefly sort of give some kind of examples of environmental security from the Russian perspective. And of course, the Russian territory is in the Arctic is vast. It is the largest one. And as we always say that there is no one Arctic region, that Arctic is different, it's very diverse. I could definitely say about the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation, that it's so different and so diverse because of its large and vast territory. And therefore, there should be very complex approach to understanding, of course, of the environmental security in the Russian Arctic, and actions and legislation that should be adopted and implemented should be done at all the levels of governance, including the global ones, for instance, the United Nations, the United Nations framework on climate change, through the regional institutions, and to the lower level of governance, including municipalities and people who are living here. And just to say that there are 4 million people living in the Arctic, and half of that population lives in the Russian Arctic. So I would just like to talk about 2 sort of major concerns when we deal with environmental security in the Russian Arctic. And those 2 ones are, of course, the climate change and its rapid pace in the Arctic, and specifically its impact on the Russian territory, and the economic activities that Russia has been doing for many decades, and going back to the Soviet Russia, starting from 1930s, and as many scholars who are writing about Russian Arctic are describing it as a
conquering of the Arctic policy led by the Soviet Union. And so now the Russian government has to deal with those consequences of the kind of conquering of industrialization of the Arctic. And just to say that the Russian Arctic is the most urbanized territories across the whole Arctic region. And sort of just to give you some sort of an example is that one of the research that was done on estimating kind of the level of pollution as a result of the economic activities in the Arctic that deals with primarily natural resources extraction. It identified so-called 27 impacted zones across the Arctic, the Russian Arctic. That means that problems with the degradation of biodiversity and impacts on humans, on people who are living in the Arctic, and particularly on health of the Arctic population in Russia. And just to give you those examples, for instance, in Murmansk region or the city of Norilsk that I'm going to talk in a few seconds. Those are industrialized kind of territories with the main production of natural resources. At the same time, when talking to people during my fieldwork, particularly in the Murmansk region, those populations, especially, for instance, in the city of Murmansk, they were also identifying kind of the major problems for them as environmental problems with waste management and air pollution. And Doug showed in his presentation all these perspectives for using shipping along the Northern Sea route. And just to tell you that for the Russian government, the city of Murmansk is sort of seen as a hub for reloading of all these goods. But it's ironically, for instance, the port is just located on the territory of the city. And when there is sort of reloading of coal, the dust from coal is spread around the city, causing air pollution. So we talk about all this very pessimistic and very ambitious projects, but at the same time, when we go on the local level, we see those environmental issues that impact people who are living there, and we should really think about and emphasize the problems while dealing with economic perspectives for the Arctic development. Going to another issue of climate change, I know that's kind of controversial in terms of political discourses in Russia, but just in the newly released Arctic strategy, the climate change is emphasized as one of the threats for the sustainable development of the Arctic region in Russia. And there is a specific emphasis on population that is living in the Russian Arctic zone. And just to give you the two, I think, very vivid examples of impacts of climate change on the Russian territory and environment in the Arctic is maybe you read this summer about the wildfires that occurred in the Republic Sakha-Yakutia, and I don't know whether a colleague of mine, Alexandra Durova, she's a PhD candidate at MIT. She actually spent summer in Yakutia during her field work, and she just experiences the smoke that surrounded the city of Yakutsk. And this and the occurrence of wildfires, of course, this is a problem for biodiversity, the question of impacts of climate change with the emissions of CO2. But I guess it's now wildfires are also talked in relation to humans, to human security, with the impacts, for instance, on health of population who are living in those territories affected by wildfires, but also in terms of security and their safety, as some of the villages had to be moved. Some people had to be moved because wildfires came just very close to the villages. Another example of climate change is connected to the economic security and energy security in Russia, is particularly that happened in May 2020 in the city of Norilsk. You have probably the direct connection to the city because there is mining of nickel, and nickel is used in production of phones. So maybe you have kind of yes. So what happened in May 2020? There was a leak of 20,000 tons of oil diesel from the storage that got into the water system. And there were all these concerns that eventually this leak will end up in the Arctic Ocean. And it was one of the actually the largest kind of environmental accident that occurred in the Russian Arctic recently. And the non-nickel company who owns that infrastructure had to pay a huge amount of fine in terms of $2 billion American dollars. It was all disputed by the company. But what is more important that it talks about the fragile Arctic environment, but at the same time the impacts on people, because they're indigenous communities living in those territories, and the question how they're going to hunt and fish. And according to local NGOs, it will take more than 10 years actually for the nature to recover from that dramatic accident. So having all these impacts, what can we do knowing that it's extremely expensive and environmentally risky, first of all, to do some economic activities? It's not only the Russian Arctic, but across the Arctic. Is of course we need more science and we need more international cooperation. And I just want to give you an example of the Arctic Council. We had a brilliant session last Tuesday led by Associate Faculty Jennifer Spencer and a Senior Fellow Joel Clement. So I really, if you didn't have chance to attend it, hopefully you'll manage to watch it online. But just to tell you that Arctic Council is an environmental forum, and the main goal is to promote sustainable development on the Arctic through science and cooperation between the 8 Arctic states, indigenous communities, and countries that share an interest in the Arctic region. And now Russia is chairing the Arctic Council. Its chairmanship will end up, if not mistaken, May 2023. And among of the issues that the Russia would raise during its chairmanship is the focus on consequences of impacts of climate change, including, for instance, the impacts on indigenous communities and people who are living in the Arctic, as well as on the infrastructure due to the sowing permafrost and its impact on degradation of the building. There is also some kind of actions where Russia was involved in terms of cleaning its territory from, as I said, from the Soviet legacy, including, for instance, removal of enormous amount of barrels that were oil barrels that were left after both like economic and also military activity in the region. But again, it's so complex, and at the same time, it's so expensive that there is a real need in terms of exchange of ideas, research, and knowledge, and joint actions from Arctic states, local population, non-governmental organizations, and other countries who share knowledge and expertise in order to address emerging and current challenges related to environmental security in the Arctic.
Thank you so much, Nadia. That was really great. We seem to be having slight problems. Are you able to show just the room on the? Let me see on the screen. It's spotlighted. I'm not quite sure why it's not just.
Would it be under Zoom tools?
Sorry about this, everyone. But a good opportunity to be thinking about questions that you have.
It's not letting me change it.
Yeah, if you got any reactions to that.
Okay, I see Rocky's face on the screen. Rocky, do you have a question?
I could definitely come up with one. Hello, everybody. I didn't mean to spotlight myself. That's a little disturbing, but yeah. Hello from the Fletcher School. Rocky Whites. I'm Director of Maritime Studies here, and big fan of what you all are doing. I think it was great talk, both talks. One question I have is, what? To me, the permafrost melt is greatly underappreciated by policymakers in temperate climates. And I think that it's a huge infrastructure issue for existing infrastructure and future infrastructure. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do we bring that more kind of into the mainstream policy discussion in the Arctic, from an Arctic environmental security perspective. And do you have any kind of creative solutions to the challenge? Because I can't think of any, but I'd love to hear yours.
I really didn't ask him to ask that question, but thank you, Rocky, for the question. It turns out that the Arctic Initiative is dealing with this question specifically, and we're funded through something called the Belmont Forum, which is an international funding organization with 4 countries, including the U.S. National Science Foundation and the Russian Science Foundation as well. What Rocky's talking about is that as the climate warms, the permafrost is thawing, and as the permafrost thaws, this changes the actual structure of the land. So much of the Arctic infrastructure, 2 parts, like roads and something called built infrastructure is built just like what we would hear in Cambridge, where the soil is strong enough to support whatever it is that you're building. But here, the permafrost is melting, and so now the soil is not able to support roads, airports, infrastructure, people's houses, buildings, towns, and it is happening at an ever increasing rate. Usually when permafrost studies have been done, it's been on the ecological part. Okay, this is back to the diagram, and there still is a lot of biological work on the permafrost, but understanding how this intersects with human resilience is extremely important. We are dealing with this on the Arctic Initiative. And I'll just give you 2 examples, and then I know Nadia has some as well. That there is a few towns in Western Alaska. One is called Shishmaref, where the town is falling apart, and it's falling apart because the ground cannot support what's there anymore. And so people are having to move an entire town to somewhere else. Well, this costs money, and now we're building, we have to build a new town in an area which also has permafrost. How do you do that? In the second, I was telling Nadia that this story. Colleagues of mine who are wildlife researchers who are working on Wrangell Island, which is it's near the Bering and the Chukchi Sea. It's a wildlife refuge. They could not land airplanes there anymore because the runways collapsed, and it's too far for helicopters. And so the wildlife biologists had to spend, I think it's almost 8 weeks, waiting until someone could pick them up. And so they were literally living off the land because the food ran out. You multiply that throughout Russia, and then Nadia can give some examples.
I mean, for Russia, the impacts of climate change on permafrost have been the issue, very important issue. And just to give you the perspective, that 60% of the Russian territory is located on permafrost. And the Russian Minister for Environment a couple of years ago just said that the impacts of permafrost would be enormous on infrastructure in Russia. That would cost something between 60,000 up to 2 billion American dollars in order to support and rebuild and reconstruct infrastructure in the Arctic. And it deals both with social infrastructure as like housing, as some cities, including Norilsk, are located on permafrost, but it also deals with infrastructure and including energy infrastructure and pipelines. And probably you've seen these beautiful pictures on the Yamal Peninsula of these huge craters. If not, just Google it after this event. That after several years are covered with lakes, but this is an enormous challenge and danger if those ones appear close to, for instance, extraction sites. And so for now, Russian energy companies are closely monitoring what is happening in the territory surrounded it. In terms of kind of a solution, I would say that Russian government and both regional and local governments are taking closer look, and I think Russia has an enormous experience in monitoring permafrost starting from the Soviet times. And now the Russian president signed an order in order to establish around 140 monitoring stations across the Russian Arctic zone for monitoring permafrost. This is one thing. Another thing that I think there is sort of kind of technology, and I often read about, for instance, how there will be a project in Norilsk in how to use some kind of devices in order to freeze the melting ground. But the issue is that who will pay for this? Municipalities don't have enough budgets for this. Regional governments probably the same. And so the question is for the national government to support it through the partnership, I guess, with business. So I guess probably we do have knowledge, but lack of money.
So I'll just add to that, and then we can go to another question, that there are first four new centers, two at the University of Alaska. We're looking at new engineering solutions for infrastructure and built infrastructure. There's also one in Canada looking at new methods for reconstruction of housing. And then there also is a fourth new center looking at new approaches to housing that is not the old-fashioned regular way. So there is active research taking place. And then here in the U.S., as you know, the infrastructure bill was just passed recently, and I've forgotten the exact number, but it's many billions of dollars are going to Alaska just specifically for this. Okay, other questions? Yes.
I had a question and you might have just answered it in the permafrost discussion, but in your like academic DHS background, what do you think the DoD specifically is like missing in their revamp policy towards the Arctic?
Okay, the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, which was mentioned, that is a center funded by the Department of Homeland Security, and that particular center, I'm the principal investigator of it. Think of it as the think tank for the Coast Guard and doing all the things that they do. Just recently, the Department of Defense announced that they will be forming a new Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. This is far different. Okay, now think about the Venn diagram again. And but this center, to answer your question, the Department of Defense is worried extremely about this because doing things the old way isn't going to work. Okay, and so what are the solutions? Well, that's what the center is for. And it is like 2 weeks old, so don't expect much. Yes.
Thank you both for being here and sharing your expertise. I had a question on the Venn diagram. So I'm wondering, there are obviously a myriad of like challenges and difficulties in research areas that you can look into. My question is, from your expertise, what do you think is the most pressing challenge as of now in the Arctic? And I know that's super hard to answer because it's probably not generalizable across countries. And how might that shift with regard to climate change in the next 50 years?
Yeah, the quick answer is all of them. Any other questions? No, I'm serious. If we were talking about an academic exercise, I probably could tell you it would be something involving finances and development. But you must understand that because climate change is happening so fast that what we have is accumulating questions and not enough people to be working on them.
In addition to problems that we had previously. Lack of housing, infrastructure, communication, not on the top of the climate change.
I know you wanted a different answer.
No, that's fine. I mean, I come from a climate background, so I understand like the interconnectedness, but I'm just wondering like what specific challenges exist in the Arctic apart from like permafrost that we might not be aware of who do not work in like the Arctic space.
Well, okay, I'll pick another area. And you know, Alaska, I don't know if you all know about Alaska, but the reason Russia, the Czarist Russia sold Alaska to the U.S. was they needed some more money for wars. We bought it, and we bought it because we were really interested in fur trade. That's what got everyone going on Alaska. And then 1960 something, I've forgotten now, discovered oil. Okay, and now Alaska is far more important. There is oil development and all that. Gold miners. Okay, and so this is mineral extraction, and that really describes most of the economic development of the Arctic is extraction, one-way extraction, whether it's fisheries, hunting, mining. So going back to the diagram I showed you about the economic in investment, with the realization and a better understanding of the use of rare earths and another thing called cobalt, where before it was so expensive and so to do any kind of this work in the Arctic, regardless of the country, it was something that was known but not really appreciated. Now there is intense interest on that, and so balancing the interest of development, financial input into local communities, and the economic effects. For example, Greenland just recently passed a prohibition against any uranium mining or even exploration, period. In Western Alaska, where there is a lot of rare earths, the state government, God don't repeat this, the governor and the legislature are rubbing their hands in glee thinking about the money that they're going to make on rare earth extraction, but then there's some other issues like someone else owns the land, people live there, the cost of transportation, and so on. Okay, does that give you kind of an idea? And you have to understand that this is all happening now.
And just as what I've started my presentation, it's really hard to say this issue is important for the general Arctic. Yes, we talk about climate change, but again, the impacts of climate change are different across the Arctic. We have this permafrost, we have Shishmarov that Doug gave as an example. For instance, I was for my fieldwork in the Norwegian Arctic city of Tromsø, and I was talking to them, and they said like, well, for now we don't have that much impact of climate change. Of course, we're located in the Arctic, but we are assuming, for instance, in future sea level rise, increase of precipitation, snow avalanches, and then we really have to think about our urban environment now. Then we go, for instance, to that city of Norilsk, where we had this accident and degrading permafrost, and there people are saying like, yeah, we do feel that now. And again, it's like the problem of how you will support population in the Arctic, because one of the major issues for Russia is, of course, is for instance, keeping the population in those places. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1990, there was like fast out migration from those places, and then it's the question for the local and regional governments is how to actually create those conditions for people to stay. And as going back to that example of Norilsk is like very important because the city is the production of this nickel ore, and so it's sort of a base for security, energy security, sovereignty for Russia. Then we go back to all the circles that Doug had in the diagram. So I mean, again, it's very different. But yes, the overarching, I think, is climate change, rapid pace in the region.
Yes.
Thanks again, also from my side. Very informative, very beautiful talk. Sorry for the question, which might be not very politically correct, or maybe it goes a bit too far. But you were speaking about extraction, resources, and now, Nadia, you were talking about energy security, getting people to stay. I was wondering if you could tell us something about what are the processes that as academicians or as people working on these issues, you would like to see locally, national level and international cooperation, because we on the spectrum between realpolitik and hopeful coordination on some issues that would take into consideration the environment, the socio-economic dynamics, security issues. We are pressed with the urgency of now, and you keep repeating it. But then you also spoke about these new routes, of the impact that countries want to continue to harvest these resources, etc., etc. I guess, how do you go about your work that sometimes might be specifically depressing, if I can say? I mean, from the outside, I don't know, because there are these countries that really want to continue to operate in certain ways, and sometimes we know that it's a little bit of greenwashing for the climate spheres, but here we speak about something that is much more complex than only climate change. Sorry for being very open, but we are at the policy school, so maybe we could talk about policy and constituencies.
I think I can give you another example that may help give you some insights on this. Has anyone here heard of Pebble Mine? Okay. Oh my gosh, if you lived in Alaska, would you know that? And let me just tell you about the Pebble Mine. It is not a mine, it is a perspective. One of the largest estimated deposits of gold and silver was discovered near Bristol Bay. And the estimates are among the largest ever made for any gold mine in Alaska. And because of that, to do the development, an international consortium, the Pebble Mine Consortium, was developed to look at this. And as many have said, 20 years ago, this would have been absolutely no issue at all. Are you kidding? Gold mine, this is what Alaska was for. And the sorts of advertisements, excuse me, that's not fair. These sorts of descriptions that were said on the development of this, the enormous amount of money that would come to the state, the employment of local people, the ability to build even new ports. And right now there's only one very small one in the area. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that the local people were not involved very much in this. And one of the concerns they had is that one of the problems with gold mining is that in order to extract the gold, you have to use cyanide. Cyanide is poisonous. And where is the mine located? At the headwaters of all the salmon streams of North and South. Not to mention where the mine is located. So some of it is federal land, but many of it is, getting back to land tenure again, land ownership, which still has not been resolved through something called ANILCA, which was set up to when Alaska was formed, on who owns the land. We're back to land tenure. And because of this, and then politicians got involved, of course. For 10 years, this has been going back and forth about local groups versus state groups, federal groups, international consortium. Ultimately, it came down to what is the net benefit? And by benefit, they're including not only money, but resources, local people, and the rest. And the story hasn't been closed on Pebble Mine, but it's reached a point where it's unlikely that it will ever be developed. Not too far away, only a couple hundred miles away, and in Alaska, this is very close. There is another mining development called the Red Dog, which is mining something else, and there is no controversy, hardly any controversy at all. So I don't know if this answers your question, but that not only is it process, but it is understanding the very complex interactions among all these different forces, like what I talked about.
So we've got a question from Zoom, if that's all right. So Nadia Colbert says, a question in the domain of resource wars from the diagram. Economic competition and competition in legal disputes over rights to sea lanes or fishing seem clear as navigable waterways open up. But how do you envision triggers, whether economic or territorial, that could escalate conflict between states?
You want me to address?
I mean, I can answer it, but go ahead, Nadia.
I mean, when we talk about the Arctic Ocean, and again, I would really encourage you to look at Sarah's talk that she gave a week ago, something like that, about the Arctic Ocean challenges and opportunities. Sarah brilliantly talks about all the complexity, resources, maritime boundaries. Just to kind of give a very brief answer on that is that if you look at the Arctic Ocean, there are two groups of people, scholars, politicians, who talk about, yes, there will be a conflict in the Arctic because of all those potential resources and shipping routes. And then there are also like politicians and scholars who talk about, look, we already cooperate in the Arctic through the Arctic Council. We have the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Most of the, except of the US, the 7 Arctic states ratified the convention. They follow the rules. They apply them when they want to extend their maritime boundaries. They do cooperate on science. Yes, the geopolitical situation outside of the Arctic region kind of has an impact on cooperation, but still in the discourses on the political level, on the national level of the 8 Arctic states, they do talk about the necessity for cooperation and keeping Arctic as the zone for peace.
3 weeks ago, I think it was, we had a talk through the Arctic Initiative that Fran Ulmer organized, and we had Larry Mayer, who was chief scientist on the recent cruise of the Coast Guard Healy. Why I'm mentioning this is that one of the things that Dr. Meyer does is bathymetry, which is understanding the depth of the water. This sounds pretty arcane, except for the Arctic Ocean. Because something that Nadia just mentioned, the law of the sea, that countries can declare continental shelf areas to be their part of their territory. Most of the Arctic Ocean has not been charted. But looking at some of the old charts and some of the rather inaccurate measurements, depending on which country you are, you could see your continental shelf going all the way to the Arctic, the North Pole. And one of the reasons that, I don't know if you remember this, a decade ago, Russia dropped a flag. Why did they drop the flag? It was on the area that if you follow this line of argument, this was on the continental shelf that would go to Russia. Well, all the other countries did the same thing. And why would we care? Extraction, mining. We don't know what's there, but it's no one's looked. One last thing, and this is for all you policy guys, people, excuse me. There is a concept called terra nullum. Is that something that you've ever heard? That's Latin for essentially no man's land. Okay, and there's two places where that exists. One is Antarctica, and that's how people get to Antarctica is through an international treaty. No one really owns it. The Arctic Ocean basin used to be considered terra nullum until this. Before it's just something that all the Arctic countries are located around. Now, there's dialogue. I'll just leave it at that. There's dialogue at the international policy level of what is an economic zone, what is a continental shelf, who gets to use what and how. And now we're getting into resource wars about boundaries. And I will just tell you one boundary that's very interesting and still unresolved is the boundary between the United States and Canada as soon as you get off land. Okay, we're all friends. Okay, there's no problem there, but it has not been resolved. It hasn't been resolved since Canada was a country.
And just for you to read about another territorial dispute, it's actually there is a Hans Island. This is a dispute between Canada and Denmark, Greenland. And I just really encourage you to read more about it. But how the two countries claim this territory is just go in there and live in a bottle of whiskey.
I've been to this island. You literally could throw a softball from one end to the other. And Denmark and Canada are all friends. But who owns the island?
It's actually a rock.
But who where that island is owned, it suddenly becomes the navigation rights and the rest.
Thank you, Nadia. That was a really great question. I think we're coming up to the end of our time here. So thank you so much to Nadia and to Doug for your brilliant discussion today. Thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to everyone on Zoom. We really appreciate you taking part as well. And we're really delighted that you've been able to join us. And yeah, thank you to all of you who've made Arctic Climate Week so successful. We couldn't have done it without you. It would have been pretty pointless for us to just talk to ourselves. So we're really grateful, and we hope that you've enjoyed it, and we hope that you continue to take part in activities and to engage with the Arctic Initiative. We really want that on campus, but also from those of you who aren't able to join us on campus. So thank you.